Why is Cregan Stark so important to the ending of House of the Dragon Season 4? The answer goes far beyond simply giving House Stark a bigger role in the final season. Cregan Stark may actually be one of the most important characters in bringing the Dance of the Dragons to an end. And if House of the Dragon follows the broad events of George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, Cregan could be the character who finally walks into King's Landing after the Targaryen Civil War has destroyed almost everything, and decides what happens next. There is one important warning before we continue. Season 4 has not aired yet, so what we're discussing here is based on the events of Fire and Blood and the direction established by the television series. The show has already changed important details from the book, so Cregan's exact ending could be different. But the reason fans are watching him so closely is very clear. Cregan Stark represents the North, and more importantly, he represents a completely different idea of power from the Targaryens. By the end of Season 3, the dance has become increasingly destructive. Rhaenyra has taken King's Landing, but her rule is becoming more brutal. Aegon is still fighting to reclaim his position. Aemon's actions have helped push the realm deeper into chaos. The Battle of Tumbleton has shown just how uncontrollable the war has become, and Helena's death leaves Rhaenyra even more isolated. The Season 3 finale ends with the Targaryen conflict nowhere near a clean resolution, but there's a character waiting in the North who has already been connected to this war: Cregan Stark. We first saw him properly when Jacaerys Velaryon traveled north and met him at Winterfell. Cregan pledged his support to Rhaenyra's cause, and the North eventually sent men south to fight for her. The first major force was the Winter Wolves, a group of older northern warriors who marched south under Roderick Dustin. The television series has already used Cregan's army to establish that House Stark isn't simply sitting out the Targaryen War. The North has chosen a side, and that decision becomes extremely important later, because Cregan's biggest contribution isn't necessarily going to happen while Rhaenyra and Aegon are still fighting. It happens after the war is essentially over. That's where the story known as the Hour of the Wolf begins. And this could be one of the most important sequences in the entire final season. Because when Cregan Stark finally reaches King's Landing, he isn't arriving to save Rhaenyra. He's arriving after almost everyone else has already lost. In Fire and Blood, Cregan arrives in King's Landing at the worst possible moment. The Dance of the Dragons is collapsing. Rhaenyra is dead. Aegon II is also dead. And the surviving Targaryens are trying to figure out who should control the kingdom. The obvious answer is Rhaenyra's surviving son, Aegon the Younger. But there's a problem. The people surrounding the throne have been involved in murder, betrayal, and political manipulation. And Cregan Stark does not simply walk into King's Landing and say the war is over. He wants justice. This is what makes Cregan so important. He fought for the Blacks, but when he discovers that Aegon II was poisoned, he does not simply ignore it because Aegon was his enemy. To Cregan, murdering a king is still murder, and that means people on both sides can be punished. In the book, Cregan takes control of King's Landing for several days, in an episode that becomes known as the Hour of the Wolf. He is eventually made Hand of the King to the young Aegon III. And suddenly, the man from Winterfell is effectively the most powerful person in Westeros. That's a remarkable development. Think about what the Targaryen Civil War has been about. Rhaenyra believes she has the rightful claim. Aegon believes he has the rightful claim. Their families have spent years killing each other over the Iron Throne. And after all that destruction, Cregan Stark arrives and helps establish what comes next. Not because he wants to become king, not because he wants a dragon, and not because he wants to create a Stark dynasty in King's Landing. He wants order. That's why Cregan can become so important to the show's ending. He represents the aftermath of the dance. For 3 seasons, we've watched characters fight over who deserves power. Cregan's story asks a different question. What happens when the fighting finally stops? And the answer is ugly. The kingdom is devastated. The dragons are disappearing. The royal family has been destroyed from within, and the boy who inherits the throne is traumatized by everything he has witnessed. Aegon III is only a child. In the book, Cregan recognizes that the realm needs someone strong enough to stabilize the transition. He takes responsibility as Hand, while also investigating the people responsible for Aegon II's death. Several figures are punished, some are executed, others are sent to the wall. One of the most significant targets is Larys Strong. And this is where Cregan's connection to the larger Game of Thrones story becomes especially interesting. Larys has spent the series manipulating events from the shadows. He's survived assassinations, betrayals, and shifting alliances. But according to the book, Cregan eventually brings that story to an end. He condemns Larys and has him executed. That could make Cregan's final role incredibly satisfying. The man who spent years moving pieces around the board finally faces someone who doesn't care about his schemes. Cregan doesn't need to outsmart Larys, he simply judges him. And that is the central idea behind the Hour of the Wolf. The Targaryens fought for the throne. Cregan arrives to decide what remains after the throne has nearly destroyed them all. There's also a much deeper reason Cregan Stark matters to the ending of House of the Dragon. He helps explain how the story connects to Game of Thrones. The audience already knows that House Stark will survive for generations. We know what the North eventually becomes. But Cregan gives us an early example of the values that later become associated with the Starks: honor, duty, oaths, and a willingness to act even when doing the right thing is politically inconvenient. That's especially important because Cregan doesn't completely behave like a traditional hero. He is willing to use violence. He is willing to execute people. He even wants to continue the war after arriving in King's Landing because he believes some enemies still need to be punished. But eventually, peace becomes possible, and Cregan accepts that. The book's Hour of the Wolf lasts only a short time, with Cregan governing King's Landing for 6 days before returning north. That's why his role isn't about becoming the new ruler of Westeros. It's about making sure the transition actually happens. Aegon III becomes king. The dance officially comes to an end, and Cregan goes back to Winterfell. In other words, the Stark doesn't take the throne. He helps determine who will sit on it. That could be the perfect ending for House of the Dragon. Because the series began with a question about succession. Who should inherit the Iron Throne? Viserys wanted Rhaenyra to inherit it. The Greens wanted Aegon, and the war destroyed both sides. But when the dust finally settles, it is Rhaenyra's son, Aegon III, who inherits the throne. And Cregan Stark becomes one of the key figures who makes that transition possible. There is also a fascinating potential final image here. Imagine the story ending with Cregan standing in King's Landing, surrounded by the consequences of the war. The dragons are dying. The great Targaryen generation is gone. The Iron Throne remains, but its victory has come at an almost unimaginable cost. And standing there is a Stark, not ruling, not claiming the throne, simply making sure the kingdom survives. That would bring the story full circle. Of course, we need to be careful about treating the book's events as guaranteed television spoilers. House of the Dragon has already changed important details from Fire and Blood, including character fates and the way major battles unfold. The Season 3 finale has also left several storylines positioned differently from the book, so we don't know exactly how HBO will portray Cregan's final role. But the destination is extremely important. The show's 4th season is planned as the final chapter, and Cregan is perfectly positioned to become the bridge between the bloody dance of the dragons and the new reign of Aegon III. So, why is Cregan Stark important to the ending? Because he represents what comes after the Targaryens destroy themselves. He brings the North into the final act. He helps secure Aegon III's succession. He demands accountability for the murder of Aegon II. He punishes some of the people responsible for the chaos. And then, unlike almost everyone who fought in the dance, he knows when to leave. Cregan Stark doesn't win the Iron Throne. He doesn't need to. His role is to make sure there is still a kingdom left after everyone else has finished fighting over it. And that may be exactly why the final chapter of House of the Dragon needs the Wolf of Winterfell.